Today's guest is Ben Burgis. Ben is a logician. He teaches at Rutgers. He has a book coming out, actually from Zero Books as well, called the Give Them an Argument. And it's specifically an attempt to provide people on the political left with the ability to counter right-wing arguments. Obviously, our current person in the White House, a lot of the nationalist movements worldwide, most of the louder voices in the federal government and many in the state are pushing us toward a very far-right future, one of extreme inequality, environmental degradation, misogyny, homophobia, racism, and so forth. Ben is trying to give us the ability to verbally counter those forces. So let me bring him on here. Ben, can you hear me?
I can.
Good morning.
Good morning, Terry.
Can you just introduce yourself a little? You teach at Rutgers, and you teach logic.
Yeah, I teach. I teach in the philosophy department at Rutgers, which means that I do teach both symbolic logic classes at different levels, and also what's really more relevant to this book and this conversation, which is like what we call logic, reasoning, and persuasion, which is the kind of class where we go through not like symbolizing arguments and breaking them down in that way, but talking about informal fallacies, so ways that ordinary arguments could go wrong, or it can look like the premises could support the conclusion even if they really don't. And so I've got the book coming out. It's available for pre-order right now, although it's not actually coming out until the end of May. And I've also been doing regular videos for Zero Books on Mondays, and I've been doing a segment on the Michael Brooks Show on Tuesday nights called The Debunk, where we go through some typically right-wing arguments, although, we've also done things like Nancy Pelosi's argument against single-payer and sort of broken it down and, looked at how to respond to them.
Right. Let's start with sort of a meta view here, rather than a specific argument. To me, and to a lot of commentators at least, observers, it appears that the political left, at least in the United States, such as there is a political left here active, doesn't have a lot of argument. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but if you look online, for instance, with digital culture, it appears, you have a lot of protests against people like Milo Yiannopoulos and so forth, that coming onto campus without any real argument against them. There are arguments, I do think, but that's the media spectacle that free speech is being curtailed. How do we get to this point, whether it's substantial that the left doesn't have an argument, or at least the media spectacle of that? How are we here where someone needs to write a book to give the left arguments to counter right-wing forces?
Yeah, so, look, there certainly are and always have been leftists, who will give you good, rigorous arguments for their positions. There are your Noam Chomsky's or Nathan Robinson, who is the editor of Current Affairs, and he'll write like 10,000-word essays for that magazine. Like all about taking apart, Sam Harris or Ben Shapiro or somebody like that.
The new age.
Whether people who are from that view, from that kind of tradition, or other kinds of right-wing reactionary figures. But it is certainly true that there's a counter trend, right? That there's a certain way in which, even though I do think, and I do want to. I do want to register this, that a lot of the media narrative about, free speech on campuses and all that stuff, I do think a lot of that's overhyped, right? So, I'm in my late 30s. I've been around college campuses in one form or another since I was 18, and I only know what the what the phrase trigger warning means, or I only know what the phrase safe space means because I've read media articles about them, right? I've never encountered these things in the wild, and granted, one anecdote is not data, but I don't think that's uncommon, right? I think that oftentimes, when it comes to these issues, about free speech and deplatforming, the prevalence of that stuff is overstated. But that said, it's not like there's nothing there to overstate.
Right. And let me say for our guests, deplatforming is when you don't allow someone to speak, basically.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, or in a broader sense, like sometimes people will object. So deplatforming in the sort of core sense means like when like protesters at some campus will shout somebody down and don't let them speak, or there's also a sort of broader sense where, for example, people will object to debating certain kinds of right-wing figures because that's giving them a platform, right? That you're, or they'll even sort of turn it into a verb, like you're platforming such and such by talking to them,
right?
And I think sometimes this does, and again, these things, these attitudes, they certainly do exist. They have, I think, a really extreme and ridiculous form. Is something that came up just this last week because when some people on the left, even some semi-prominent media figures like Mehdi Hassan, were objecting to Bernie Sanders for being willing to do a town hall on Fox News on the grounds that he would, even though he's running for president of the United States, and this is the, for better or for worse, certainly for worse in my view, but this is the most popular news network in the United States. So to my mind, it would be completely ridiculous if he didn't try to, bring his message there. A lot of people had the view that, well, you're legitimizing, Fox by being willing to be on the network, or similarly, I have actually an article out today in Quillette magazine with my friend Matt McManus, where even it's called "Why Everybody Values Freedom," and it's an argument. The article is an argument for a left-wing view about how to understand freedom and how social democracy and even socialism can actually expand freedom.
Right.
But some people are very critical of any leftist who's willing to write for a magazine like that because they think.
Pause on that for a second, because I want to touch on that more specifically, but I want to back up just a little because you first in the spectacle of looking at the left as not being able to deal with these right-wing arguments and the seeming silliness of these college deplatformings. First, this is why what I was hearing you say, I agree with what I believe you're saying. I just turned 52 at the end of February, to give you a context of where I come from chronologically. And to me, anything that happens in an undergraduate setting is by definition silly. The reason is not that the people are silly, but that space is there for people to begin experimentation with their lives. When I went to art school, and when I did, I was stunned by the men I met teaching art, because I come from a very kind of Trailer Park, Kentucky background. And so to see men laughing, to see men not wearing dirty, drab-colored, grimy work uniforms, and that alone blew my mind, which tells you...
Right.
So when you go to college, you experiment with your lifestyle, you experiment with different ideas, and if you do something that might be interpreted as counter to your stated values, I think that should be allowed without a lot of critique, and it shouldn't be reflective on a bigger culture. But in terms of deplatforming, or not having right-wing people speak, there was a time, I remember this in Kentucky, again, in Louisville at least, around 2000, 2001, where the Bellarmine University was inviting anyone who could articulate a political viewpoint to speak on stage. Their attempt was to broaden the platform so that you have people not only coming from a Republican view or a Democratic view, which are so similar in practicality, that you could have an anarcho-syndicalist or a libertarian, right-wing libertarian. And they wanted to invite, there was a group of Nazis, neo-Nazis, that was doing, they were doing all types of, you call them events, but basically harassments locally. And they wanted to invite them. So I personally invited them because people were terrified of this. And I took some heat from that. But interestingly, they wouldn't come. Because they didn't have an argument. What they had was, accoutrement of intimidation. But if you hear what they're actually saying with a microphone and a podium and an audience, it just becomes ridiculous. So I'm concerned. See, with the left, to me, and this is my own agenda. I didn't come into the world with a particular political view. I began reading, and I began talking to people, and I began thinking. And to me, what traditionally we call the left, I could call the empirically based and the logically based. And I could defend that. But it stuns me because of that, and that's, of course, my predilection there to see things in that way. It stuns me that we're having to debate misogyny, to debate racism, to debate things that I thought were settled back when, in 1970, at least 1980, maybe 1900. And if you read good leftist arguments from anarchists, from socialists, and so forth, or just from logicians, Bertrand Russell, for instance, talking about misogyny and talking about religious bigotry, this was done a long time ago. So to see, these college students be portrayed as the left and these, to me, neo-fascist elements be portrayed as the defenders of free speech is mind-boggling. And I really think a book like yours is welcome. But I wanted to start there so we kind of lay the groundwork for where we're getting before we get to anything specific. So to you, as I heard, you're basically seeing a media spectacle. That's what I was gathering. You're not really seeing that leftists don't have arguments against these positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a germ of truth in the media spectacle, and I totally agree that it's unreasonable to. The amount of focus that some people put on the sort of excesses of some undergraduate student protesters is completely ridiculous, right? We have gotten to a point where any time that anything happens on any college campus in the English-speaking world that kind of fits this narrative, it's broadcast everywhere. But
usually by Fox News and that type. I mean, and then it gets sent out through the lesser
Fox
far rights.
News and Breitbart and all that stuff. Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. But I think that the media spectacle does have some real material to draw on, and not, unfortunately, just from 19-year-olds who are just starting to figure all this stuff out, right? So I think that one problem is that one problem actually is, as far as the project book goes, in terms of really thinking about breaking down arguments and responding to arguments, is that a lot of times the sort of rhetoric of logic has been really weaponized by a certain subset of people on the right, who really like talking that way, or Ben Shapiro was even referred to in a glowing New York Times profile as
the rhetoric of logic. I'm sorry, go ahead. Finish.
No. I mean, I was just saying that the rhetoric of logic, it's not necessarily to say that these people are making great arguments. In fact, very often they're not at all. But the sort of rhetorical posture of, we're just interested in looking at the arguments and seeing where they lead, whereas you people are fluffy and, interested in emotion, that posture has become so common for some folks on the right that then some well-intentioned leftists have kind of learned to distrust anything that smacks of that rhetorical posture, to kind of roll their eyes when they hear this stuff. And
why do you think that is? Well, because let's just stay with that for a second. Because when I was younger and I was reading, because I read everything. I don't have any censorship. I've read everything from Mein Kampf to Capital. So when a Nazi, they are Nazis, so whatever we want to call Fox News and the rest of these commentators, these views are fascistic, Nazistic, whatever. They're far-right views. When I read those when I was younger, they were very straightforward. And now, no one would have said that I am a bigot because I'm more logical. The point of being a bigot was that the object of my hatred is odious. And so whether it's a particular ethnic group or it's a gender or people from a particular country, they are repulsive, and I'm going to point out that fact, and therefore I have these positions. It wouldn't be that I'm a defender of free speech and logic. These are Enlightenment values. And the left always had the, to me, moral and intellectual high ground of taking those first and saying we are the logical ones and we are the ones who have evidence, and I still agree with that. And now, how have we come to that point that the right has taken that mantle? I mean, and they've taken it, as you said, that's why I wanted to point out that phrase, the rhetoric of logic. They've taken it as a costume. But not a substance. But why are we here? I mean, is this a facet of media, digital technology? I have some ideas, but I'm curious what you think about why we're here.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of contributing factors. I think that one of them is honestly is that. I think the decline of the decline of the labor movement, the fact that the socialists left in the United States up until very recently, like 3 years ago, right? Was really kind of in the extreme margins of American politics. Means that a lot of rather than kind of see. I think leads to a problem where rather than seeing politics in a more reasonable way as this kind of this clash of values and ultimately a clash of interests where you're trying to win over as many people as possible, right. So you can win, right? Very often people who are used to existing on the margins politically, I think get way too used to seeing politics purely as a matter of individual moral commitment, right? That rather than being an attempt to actually win a bunch of people over and win social reforms or win socialism or anything like that. You're just sort of individually morally taking a stand, and then anybody which tends to lead to a view where people who aren't yet convinced or have some bad takes or have some weird combination of views, but maybe you could persuade them. That tends to lead to this kind of pathological dynamic where you just end up seeing those as bad people, who should just be morally condemned, or or another thing, or oftentimes people who don't really feel like they have a lot of real world political power, kind of take solace in just sort of mockery, of the opposition. And it's not that I don't think that either of those things are necessarily always bad or always wrong, right? There are certain things, look, you were talking a minute ago about the rise in the age of Trump of all of these kinds of bigotries that, that one might have hoped were, left behind in the Archie Bunker era, So there's certainly things in the world that deserve to be morally condemned, and I have nothing against even fairly rough humor, but they have but I think the problem is if these are the only tools in your arsenal, that like when you're pushing back against the right, that's just strategically that's a bad move for at least two reasons. One of which is that a lot of people who, and look, don't get me wrong. I mean, I don't think that everybody can be convinced. I've never been, my claim is not that like arguments are the only things that we should be doing, or that we can win the world with arguments. That if we just give a good enough moral argument,
we don't need just arguments, but at the same time, a Nazi position, for instance, and they're out there on YouTube, these neo-fascist, extreme misogynistic positions. Those positions, there's no arguing with their devotees. Their devotees are to me, well, whatever. They're off the charts. It's the people who are looking and listening that aren't devotees necessarily of any particular persuasion that want to see, as I did as a young person, they want to see who is logically correct and who actually has evidence behind this. Racism has no evidence if you break it down, and it's
exactly.
So
and it's really dangerous. That's what I was going to say. That you have that one of the real dangers if you only respond to these people with mockery, moral condemnation, is that those people you're talking about who are not devotees, right? But who like don't share necessarily our moral taboo against taking these ideas seriously. But like who might still be winnable, of which there are lots, right? Lots of people have strange combinations of views. Lots of people, go back and forth. So these people who might be winnable, we lose them. We lose people that we don't have to lose if we never get around to showing what's wrong with these ideas, with the arguments, right? Because and then, like, the other problem is that if when we're talking about our primary, political opponents, all we have is mockery or moral condemnation, then when differences arise, within the left, among people who do share a lot of the same political goals, that, as happens, all the time, right? That, like, quite legitimately, like that, because there are a lot of things, tactical issues, strategic issues, policy issues, that it's just not obvious what the right answer is. And if your only tools are mockery or moral condemnation, then inevitably this is what you're going to turn on each other, and that's.
And mockery and moral condemnation or free flow is the other future. And I'm Terry Tapp, your host. My guest is Ben Burgis. He's the author of the upcoming book, Give Them an Argument. And yeah, I totally agree. Those are free floating. I love mockery. There should be much more of it. But you can mock anyone. You can mock your parents. You can mock your children, your boss, your employees. I mean, you can mock anyone. It's not. It's neutral in many ways.
Exactly.
And moral condemnation really comes from an emotional viewpoint often, and not a logical viewpoint, an ethical program. And so those are free-floating. The logical and evidential base is foundational. And, I wonder, in a way, there's a book called Film in the Anarchist Imagination. I forgot who wrote this, but in that book, the author argues that while many on the farther part of the political left have lost since the 70s at least, culturally they've won. And if you look at painting, if you look at dance, if you look at music, not pop music, of course, but these more obscure and as people used to say, underground musics, and writing, that the ideals of the left have won in that cultural sphere. And at a time, now we're moving away from the time, but at a time, if you expressed bigoted ideas in the 90s publicly, you would be condemned for this. I believe it was at an actual forum where I was listening to Slavoj Žižek, and he said, we're not going to discuss whether rape is moral or not. Like that's all. Certain things are off the table. We have common grounds, and now, given where the culture has gone, that's not the case. So I wonder if we won in many ways, at least culturally, not politically, and let go of the very reason we got to that point, at least. The argumentative reason why painting should be able to not have a subject, or why writing can have this more free form. Does that make any sense?
No, it totally makes sense. Although I mean, it's uneven. I think it's like certainly one counterexample that comes to mind. Just because it's an example I've been thinking about for a couple reasons. David Griscom was talking about this on the Michael Brooks show on Tuesday, is country music, right? So, like in some ways, the trajectory there has been exactly the opposite, right? Like Johnny Cash, supported civil rights and the struggles of Native Americans, and talks about poverty and opposed the Vietnam War.
Willie Nelson, too. IWW, labor movements, farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. Willie Nelson, that whole kind of like outlaw era things were like, politically much better, than they are now. Right. Like it's kind of hard to imagine anything, with any kind of like remotely left-wing values getting played on, a lot of country music stations today.
I see that as a pastiche, today's country music. This is off topic, but I liked some of that, like Johnny Cash, for instance.
Yeah.
A lot of it I didn't like because I grew up inundated with that in Kentucky, rural Kentucky. But the thing is that a lot of those performers came from a poor or working class background, and a lot of what's going on today are people that are promoted basically by a committee, by a company. Their music is written for them, and they have all the trappings of that time period. I know because I have no fashion sense. I still dress, like musicians from the 70s in boots and t-shirt and blue jeans. But these people don't, and they're coiffed, they're fashioned by a consultant, and so they're putting on the attire of that time. But actually they're marketing brands. So, but
sure, yeah. I mean, and which is not unrelated to some of the source of the problem. Exactly. Like maybe the sort of increasing like corporate consolidation of a lot of that music. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of other spheres, I mean, that's certainly true. Like, I think that I think so both within culture in that sense of art and music and a lot of those things, and also in terms of cultural issues, right? There, in some ways, there have been an enormous number of progressive victories over the course of the last few decades, and such that it can be kind of jarring when you think about the fact that on cultural issues things have gone so well. At the same time as on sort of core economic issues, certainly, in many ways, things have gone in the opposite direction.
Yeah, right? They've gone completely in the opposite direction.
Yeah, that we have. So so on the one hand we have the fact one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination, for president is openly gay, and that's barely an issue. Right. That's like something people sort of bring up every once in a while, but it's not even like a big area of focus. The candidate who I certainly support, something that in a previous, not that long ago, would have been considered, like fantastically significant about him is that he's A, Jewish, and B, not religious,
Right, and he's dodged that.
And he's totally dodged that. But at the same time, this has happened in an era of rampant neoliberalism that the welfare state, has been under sustained attack for decades and has really been rolled back a lot. That the union movement has been decimated,
yes.
But I think that maybe the fact, and I wonder if maybe this is some of what you're getting at, the fact that there have been all of these cultural victories probably gave a lot of people a false sense of complacency.
Right. And, well, it's easy to have those victories and not push for your wallet. I mean, ultimately, it has amused me throughout my life that you can pull out this question, which is, does this affect my money? And
right.
And if you pull that question out about anything, you'll find out where the real nerve center is. If you ask someone, is it okay if I smoke pot? And and they say it's illegal. It is legal. Whatever we're saying, we're not promoting it. I'm giving you some right now. Whatever you're going to say, and then you say, am I going to be making more money? Or if you say, may I marry the person I love? And they say no, yes. So we're going to whatever response to that. But you say, are we going to have enough money to comfortably live on? All of a sudden, the rancor goes up. Going back to that for a second, you were talking about the economics moving in one direction and the cultural issues moving in another. I wonder, and again, this is why I think something like what you're doing is vital. I wonder if this is a prelude, because if you take away people's economic power and yet you give them the right to use whatever substances within brackets that they want, to marry who they want, to vote for whatever pre-selected managed candidate they want. You give them the ability to use words like socialism in public, at least with certain adjectives, democratic socialism, and yet you denude them of any economic power, so that they're essentially at a peasant level. Does any of this matter? And once you do that, since you have rendered powerless that person to such an extent, it's easy just to recoup the cultural conservatism you seemingly lost. I see that right now, and I'll give you this and then let you speak. I saw an article where a lot of the aristocrats in Europe are actually actively funding not only the nationalist movements, but the anti-gay movements, the misogynistic movements. All these candidates and policies are being pushed by the wealthy in Europe.
Yeah, I mean I think that there's a certain extent to which that could definitely happen. That if you have that because of the economic misery that's been caused by neoliberalism, by in other words the rollback of the welfare and regulatory states, the rollback of organized labor, that's certainly one possible response to this can be these sorts of right-wing populist or nationalist movements, and that if they're successful, then you can have these cultural rollbacks too. Although I have to say, it is interesting that it's not necessarily going to be a package deal, right? That in other words, look at Trump, right? That Trumpism is one of the really interesting things about it is that it's not tremendous. It's very it's very racist, of course, but in a lot of respects, it's not tremendously culturally traditionalist, right? That there is there isn't a lot of religiosity, for example, around Trumpism. It's a little bit less, I don't know, like maybe to use this analogy, it's like a little bit less like Mussolini, where it's going to come in kind of, with the cross and the flag, right, as the phrase goes, and a little bit more like Berlusconi, where
yeah, it's interesting because on social media, I still see quite a few people from West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Georgia, my old stomping ground that I know well, and they don't want you to take away their weed, even if they support Trump, and even if they support traditional marriage and so forth, they still want to have affairs and not be called out on it. And they still want to have divorce. I mean, I don't care about these things, and I think it's silly to care about them, but as far as traditional values, those aren't traditional values. And the fact you're supporting a candidate who's been married multiple times and who's said the things and used the words publicly that he has regarding women and his regard for women, that's not a traditional value. I mean, when you had classical fascist Nazi candidates in Europe, Hitler, for instance, I hate to pull out, this trope, but Hitler had photographs with, the classic German Heidi. You have the little Aryan girl with her her basket of flowers and, her traditional German dress and so forth. Donald Trump wouldn't be the American equivalent of that. So, yeah, there is this weird breaking apart. And candidates like Marine Le Pen, she supports the French welfare state. I hate calling it welfare state because it's what we should have. It's not welfare in a derogatory sense. But all of the trappings of life in France that make you economically sustainable as an individual and that sweeten your life. She wants those. You just have to be white and heterosexual and Christian. And that's odd, though, because traditionally she would simply side with the aristocrats. But Macron is actually the aristocratic candidate in terms of the money. And that's a weird reshuffling that's going on right now with that. Can we talk about? I want to. We've got like a little over 20 minutes left. And I want to. There's so much we could talk about with this. I'm curious. So these intellectuals, and I put that in quotes, against whom you're constructing arguments, the Milo Yiannopoulos types, the Jordan Petersons, they've taken on this mantle of the bearers of free speech, and I still am stunned by this. But I will leave my astonishment and hopefully everyone else's to the side for a second. That's an issue we could talk about for hours and perhaps not resolve. But what do you see as appealing to them? They're appealing to a lot of younger men, especially. What do you see about that? Because you're teaching right now, and I've talked to people who teach, and they're stunned when they hear that you can't study certain people, Karl Marx or Michel Foucault, because they're part of a cultural Marxist mix, and they're there to deceive you and lead you down some primrose path to, I don't know exactly where the silliness is supposed to go, but what appeal do you think these people are having to those younger folks?
Yeah, well, some of it connects with what we were just talking about, which is this sort of combination of what, from our perspective, we'd see as cultural progress with what from our perspective, seems like horrible economic defeats,
right.
And of course, I do emphasize from our perspective because, in terms of what we, as leftists want, right? Because, we want a world where everybody, one way I'd think about it is that we want a world where everybody has the economic ability to live their life however they choose, right? That they have that. So, what differentiates us from, libertarians who would say people could live their life however they want, is that we're realistic about the fact that if people are legally allowed to live their lives however they want, but in practice they're under the thumb of the boss and they can't really afford to do this or that or the other thing, it doesn't mean a lot.
Or means nothing. Really?
Yeah, exactly. Given that vision of the world, right? We see progress in one direction and regress in the other. But, of course, there's a certain sense in which these two things aren't going in opposite directions. They're going in the same directions. Because what it is that in a certain way, capitalism itself is a liberalizing, force. That's something that breaks that, that breaks down in both good ways and bad ways, that breaks down traditions and communities and all these things, and often, and some of that's good and liberatory, right? It's good if nobody cares, what somebody's sexual orientation is and all that stuff. But what's not so good is that oftentimes people are really stressed out and socially atomized because they, because of economic conditions, right? Because people have to work so hard that they have that they're not taking vacations, that they have to it's hard to maintain stable relationships often because of economic stress. And so certainly when you mentioned Jordan Peterson and, these, kind of alienated young men, who flock to him. And I think that's certainly part of the puzzle there is that, that these people oftentimes, and, I'm not even just talking about people who are poor, but even people who are doing fine in a certain sense, right? These kinds of economic neoliberalism still hurts them because they're, everybody has to be hustling all the time, and it's very stressful, and it's very bad. And certainly when you're not doing so well, if you're, for example, a lot of people who've graduated from college and they're in their 20s who have to go live with their parents because they can't afford a place of their own. And that's bad. And, just about every, I love my parents. I love visiting them. But, that's, having to go live with your parents because of that, is bad in just about every way. And certainly it's bad for their human connections with others. And certainly it's bad for their, ability to form romantic relationships. And so Jordan Peterson, somebody like that, he has a diagnosis to offer them. His diagnosis is, this is the fault of the cultural liberalization and feminism and all of that stuff. That's why, you're single and you feel empty and meaningless and, all of these problems in their lives, he'll give them that solution. But I think something that's a really yawning contradiction at the heart of Peterson's worldview is that on the one hand, he wants to position himself as the defender of all these traditional values, and stable, or even kind of old-fashioned patriarchal family and all this stuff. But on the other hand, he's very much a defender of capitalism, which is itself the thing that's tearing down a lot of
very values.
Those very values.
There's a book by R.H. Tawney written in the 1920s, very dry British book, and he's British, but his writing style is very dry, and it's amazingly insightful, however, contrary to the style, called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And he looks at these different views that formed capitalism. And he talks about, early Christianity and Christianity of the Middle Ages even was contrary to this new thing that emerged actually out of Holland called mercantilism. And mercantilism basically is a liberalizing force in the sense that if you have enough money for something, or if you have money and someone wants to sell you something, the moral constraints are loosened, and sometimes now they're lost, but they're loosened. A Christian had at that time had barriers, so that if you asked, say, a Christian woman if you could buy an intimate evening with her, prostitution, of course she wouldn't do that because that violates her moral code. But if you went to Holland and you asked, theoretically, a man, if he would sell you a book that he disagreed with, for instance. Well, how much do you have? I mean, that definitely violates. Look, there's an interesting thing here, and these are touchy subjects to discuss on the radio because we do have limits through the FCC. But I puzzle over this. You have Jordan Peterson, and he as you said, he comes off as this defender of arch-conservative values, and yet also defends neoliberal capitalism, and there's a 2 miles of barbed wire between those two things. Also, he attracts these young men that are suffering from some of the worst of neoliberalism, at least within these industrial countries. They're not starving and collecting charcoal in the rainforest, but they are looking for work, underemployed, unemployed, struggling with their relationships and things. And they're hearing from him this mishmash about cultural Marxism, which we should get to, which is a Nazi term that he uses quite a bit. They're also hearing about postmodernism and Marxism itself, which are contrary things as well.
Yes, they are.
But what I hear is, and I'll just lay this out, and it's one of many puzzles that I could present, because none of this to me is resolved. But a lot of the young men that are devotees of him are also devotees of these very right-wing presenters of the intellectual dark web. They're devotees of, I actually took a couple of months, or I guess a month, and listened to a lot of their podcasts. They're devotees of racism, misogyny, extreme misogyny, and a lot of cultural, to me, debris, that's things that were thrown off, like we should have advanced past this. But the interesting thing is they blame others specifically for their plight that have nothing to do with it. And I've been in their situation economically and just socially, culturally, as any person has. Speaking specifically the so-called incels, involuntarily celibate, that are devotees of Peterson.
Sure.
What's interesting, and again, I'm couch this in the language that we can, but if you are a young man, say you're 19 years old, and you're not making much money, and you don't have a girlfriend, and you're very angry. I've been there, and women have been there, men have been there. This is just part of the human condition.
Sure.
You're very lonely. I've been there. They want to take violent action, which I felt too. And I felt it against my boss. I felt it against, a mayor. We all feel this. You want to strangle your boss, and you want to go out with your girlfriend, and you barely have enough money, and so you're ready to throttle this guy. That's a human expression of frustration. But somehow there's a link now that angry, lonely young man wants to go to a yoga studio and harm women, or wants to run women over with his car. And I see that emanating from people like Peterson. And I'm not hearing where that link is exactly coming in. So it's like they're speaking something coded that I'm not getting. And I've talked with friends of mine my age and younger too, and they're not getting that either. And I'm wondering where that kind of anger, not just toward women, but that group of people, is where that anger in general is being pushed. Does that make any sense? I'm trying to grasp at something that's not really easily articulated.
Yeah, no, I think so. So, I think somebody like Peterson, he doesn't, it's not that, I wouldn't go so far as to say that he's encouraging people to do, like what Elliot Rodger did, but
Right.
But he does kind of feed into this narrative that these people you're talking about have. In fact, in a way that I think is kind of undermines his self-help message, because granted, like we've been talking about, there are aspects of what's driving a lot of this stuff that are, beyond any, that aren't just a matter of individual behavior or whatever. There are larger social forces here.
Right.
But it seems to me that if you actually wanted to help people, then when somebody came to you and said, I'm involuntarily celibate, you'd say, well, don't blame people, don't blame anybody else for not wanting to date you. Let's get you, and let's help you have a better attitude, and let's help you, get out there and change yourself, in
right.
ways that are more likely to help you out of this problem. Whereas I think, Lynn Peterson does have a lot of this anti-feminist message that actually just sort of feeds into their defeatism about their personal life, that, it's all the fault of, these feminists, and rather than trying to fix themselves. And also, this actually I do think brings us to this business about cultural Marxism, which you're right. I mean, it does.
It's Goebbels' term.
Yeah. It's a very creepy thing to hear now, being thrown around, because that is originally a Nazi term.
There are other Nazi terms they're using too, and I mean, if we want to play naivete and be the dupe, we can wonder why they're using them. But if we want to actually use our frontal lobes, we know why. But yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So of course, that's very. That's very creepy, and the fact that it's being thrown around is very revealing. But but I think that that part of why somebody like Peterson, for example, who is who's not. I mean, he's very bad. He's very reactionary. I mean, he's not a Nazi, but why? When he hears people use these Nazi terms, he latches onto that, and I think part of what he probably has in mind, maybe, is this wild conflation that he does. This, you were bringing this up earlier about, the idea that the sort of resistance to, you mentioned Marx and you mentioned Michel Foucault, and this is something that Peterson does all the time. He equates all of the intellectual trends he doesn't like as the same thing. Right. So he says, he talks about postmodern Marxism, even though, as you pointed out earlier, postmodernism and Marxism are diametrically opposed things, right? Postmodernism emerged as out of resistance to these sort of grand narratives about history, of which, the Marxist idea about class struggle driving history and
it is a grand
success,
narrative.
Economic. Yeah, it's a grand narrative. And in fact, it's one of the main grand narratives they were thinking of.
Yeah.
Right? It's so like Foucault, and somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a Marxist, and Michel Foucault, hated each other.
Exactly. For the very reasons that point to the logical contradiction in Peterson's thinking.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
But Peterson likes. Speaking of grand narratives, right? Peterson.
Well, he's a Christian. How could you be a Christian and not like grand narratives?
Sure, yeah. And the sort of Christianity, that he's interested. I think something he really gets from the Christian tradition is this kind of apocalyptic view of the world, and so he has. It's really to him, it's these things are all the forces of darkness, right? And of course, the easiest way to put a bow on that is to associate all of them with Marxism, so it could be an anti-communist narrative, and so which is actually in a way. Peterson is a little old-fashioned about that, right? Because that stuff doesn't quite have the same. For a lot of people now, that kind of Bircher, anti-communist stuff doesn't quite have the same bite, that it used to. But he certainly does, right? He'll rant and rave about gulags and things like this.
This is what he does. He pitches all this into the same stew. And I see that, a lot of these people are building up towards something because he'll talk about feminism, he'll talk about post-structuralism, postmodernism, Marxism, and he'll mention someone on campus, and then he'll talk about a gulag, like you said, and a million dead. And clearly the juxtaposition is an implication of causality.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it almost feels, it almost feels petty to sort of put on my logic instructor hat
right.
and say that, when when he's saying these things, when he's going ranting about the gulag and everything, that like if this is supposed to be an argument certainly against anything that that we mean or anything that really anybody in contemporary America means when they talk about socialism, it's committing the fallacy of equivocation. You're using the same term in two different ways, and the argument relies on that, right? Clearly nobody has advocated Stalin's Russia as a social model.
Or Mao. He's talking about Mao.
China.
Mao's a monster.
Right. Yeah, totally. But then, like again, he's all putting it in the same stew, and that's where I think a lot of the stuff about cultural Marxism comes in, because to a great extent, his real target is cultural liberalization. Feminism, gay rights. People asking him to call trans students in his classes by their preferred pronouns, stuff like that.
Yeah, he's actually said that they're going to jail him if he uses the wrong pronoun, and I don't see how people aren't just taking a breath and asking themselves, like, when would that ever happen where you have police descending being like, exactly what pronoun did you use in that sentence structure, sir? And then handcuffing this warbling, mess of a professor and carting him off. I mean, what if he continued to use that pronoun in jail?
Yeah, right.
I mean, the ridiculousness is...
the bill, Peterson originally rose to prominence ranting and raving about this Bill C-16 that would add gender identity to the pre-existing human rights law, which he maintained would have this consequence you're talking about. Now, as I understand it, Bill C-16 has actually been on the books for a couple of years now.
Yeah, it's been on there, and Canadian lawyers have actually written saying that there's specific terminology in the bill that just says that if you commit a hate crime and you use some sort of slur or purposely, point out that this trans woman, for instance, you're calling a man, as you're attacking them physically, hurting them, that you're actually committing a hate crime. It's just a way of actually legally setting a ground so that you can prosecute someone hate crime. Ben, we're just about out of time, man, unfortunately. I really enjoyed the discussion. Can we have you back on and pick it up from there? Because, in the notes I had, there's plenty more we could talk about, man.
Absolutely, I'd love to.